Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our Deep Dive podcast. I'm joined by Ryan Romeo, and off camera, we got Dalton Davis hanging out in the back, as he always is.
Hello.
Yep.
So with his mic ready.
That's right. He's ready with those occasional nuggets of Dalton Davis wisdom,
yes,
as we so value and appreciate. But today is the first of our deep dives on our new series, Strange Land. So we're going to be talking about how do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land. And really, this is a series where what we're getting into is more of the sense of how do we exist in a culture of the kingdom, in the church, in the middle of a culture that is not a culture of the kingdom, in the middle of a world that is not in line with the kingdom of heaven, that is not trying to follow God, and we're calling out something that people have been feeling for a while, but has felt particularly poignant for the last 4 or 5 years, right? Where it felt like a few years ago there was at least an illusion, if not a reality, maybe a little bit of mix of both, that American culture was at least heavily influenced by the Christian worldview, by followers of Jesus, which is not to say that it's not still. But it
was like synonymous almost. It was like there was just
Christian nation.
Yeah, we were a Christian nation kind of thing.
One nation under God, that felt like a real thing. And then there were, for a while there have been some dissenting voices who said, I don't agree with that. I don't want to be part of that.
Sure.
But there's been a paradigm shift for sure. We felt it really acutely in 2020.
Yeah.
And some things have been taking place that are just surprising. We're hopefully aware of the fact that believers all around the world face persecution. The Bible makes that really clear. We are not facing anything anywhere near what many of our brothers and sisters are elsewhere in the world. But, when Jesus said, "Blessed are you when others revile you and hate you and slander you and, say false things about you for my name's sake," that's something that was maybe felt more hypothetical for most of us, for most of our lives, other than maybe if you were in junior high, someone slandered you for following Jesus, and not something most adults dealt with very often or witnessed, and we felt that change a little bit. And so we've been reacting to that, I think, for a while as believers, and some believers have been reacting that in some weird ways, maybe some pretty unhealthy ways even, and some others in pretty healthy ways. And so what we're wanting to do in this series, right, is just dig into the Word of God and say, how do we live in exile? How do we live as a culture, as a subculture, as a set-apart culture in the midst of another culture? How do we do this well? And what's interesting is the Word of God has a lot to say on this.
Tons.
And it's not what we think it is going to say sometimes. It might just surprise us. We did this in the Gospel of Mark, which we just finished up. Jesus had some surprising things to say and to teach us when it comes to politics.
Yeah, I love that series, by the way. That was a fun series.
Yeah, it was honestly got deep in me in some really good ways. I felt like the Lord said and did a lot. But Ryan, you preached our first message on this series just a couple of days ago on Sunday. Brought us into Jeremiah, really all over Jeremiah. With
I tried to fit all of Jeremiah.
All of Jeremiah in there, right? Because we're going to be talking about exile, and Jeremiah obviously is talking about and interacting with the exile. We'll spend some time in the book of Daniel. We'll spend some time in some other books, and even a little bit in the New Testament as we talk about what does the Bible say about living in a different culture and being set apart. So,
well, and I think you and I were talking before we hit record on falling in the trap of trying to do too much in a message, and I definitely try to squeeze a lot of Jeremiah in. And it's so hard because it's such a great book, and it feels it's in a funny way. I felt so strong this connection between Hosea and Jeremiah, even though they're separated by 130, 140 years. They are both the 11th hour prophets. They're both saying things are about to get bad, and the people are like, we don't see it. Everything seems fine. And they're going, no, things are not fine. Yeah. And it is not a popular message at all. And so it's like, as we're in this exile series, most everything we're going to be talking about is post-exile. But Jeremiah is that he's got like 1 foot in pre-exile and 1 foot in post-exile. And just the sort of to me, it feels very visceral when you're reading Jeremiah. Mm-hmm. Like he feels the tension of what the Lord's saying.
Yeah.
He's gone through like even the revival where they find the Word of God and they read it again. So he's seen some good years.
Yeah.
But in the background, all of his prophecies are like, guys, this stuff is still happening behind the scenes. There is this injustice that's going on. There's this sickness in our culture. There's this darkness in the priesthood, in the prophets, and it's not good, and it's leading toward exile. And I just felt like I got a real good deep dive into, and we overuse that phrase, but a really
this
good
is a deep dive podcast.
Hey, there it is. Okay, maybe
dive.
It's just on point for branding.
It's our zinger,
But it was like you get into his world. He's the weeping prophet. There's real honest conversation he has with God. You know, at some point he's like, I've been preaching for 23 years and nothing's changing, And a guy that on the surface, you would say like, you'd probably, in our today paradigm, we'd be like, we should probably let that guy go. There's no fruit in his ministry. Yeah. Maybe you should go do something different, Jeremiah. He is often the kind of people that God uses that on the surface don't seem like they are successful at all. And yet, almost 2,500 years later, we're still reading his words, and it's impacting us even now.
Yeah. I remember at one point picking up on that and actually skimming through Jeremiah, trying to find an example of one time that anybody listened to him. And it wasn't the most thorough search, but I was unable to find a time when anybody listened to what Jeremiah said. And there's even that time when the people of Israel are saying, Jeremiah, what should we do? We promise we'll listen to you.
Yeah.
And he goes, ask the Lord, tells him what the Lord says, and they say, we're going to do the opposite. It's like when your wife asks you which dress she should wear.
Yes,
and it's 100% it's going to be the opposite one you say,
Totally. Yep. And there's that scene where, Hilkiah comes to him and Jeremiah is like very, he's wearing the yoke of the Lord and he shows up and he's wearing the yoke of the Lord. I think it seems like for about 2 months, which he's pretty theatrical and he's very committed to it. Like for 2 months, he's carrying around this like yoke for oxen. And then I'm pretty sure it's Hilkiah. One of those popular prophets comes up, grabs it, smashes it on the ground, and he goes, the Lord's not saying this. Like, we're not going to go into captivity. We're not going to be under the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, And it just really feels like it almost feels like a 1990s bully movie. Like, nobody's listening to Jeremiah. Everyone's like pushing him down in the hall. Like, he broke
my yoke.
He broke my yoke, yeah. And then Jeremiah comes back with like a metal yoke and he's like, break this thing, Like it just there's some kind of funny imagery in there. There's some very theatrical imagery in there. But at the end of the day, Jeremiah's got an unpopular message.
Yeah.
And he's speaking to a nation, and this is the kind of unavoidable parallel. The more you read into it, the more you're like just exactly what you're saying. They're going, we are a country, we are a nation who is blessed by God from the very beginning. We are God's chosen people. How dare you say we're going to find ourselves under the yoke of somebody like Nebuchadnezzar?
Yeah.
And on its surface, you would say, well, yeah, I mean, is Babylon worse than what Israel's doing? Well, yes. But God's going, look, I'm going to use them to correct you. And then he has things to say against Babylon too, eventually, But he's like, look, I'm going to use these people to get your attention. But you could just feel that tension of like, and you could almost feel that in our country now. Like, how could you say America's not sitting on the top of the heap anymore? How could you say that we would face something that would actually cause us to lose, wealth or comfort or all of these things that I think for a lot of us, we've enjoyed several generations that are pretty comfortable. Yeah. And we've fought things over there, wars, but to actually say, what if something comes back here? People say, oh, it's fear-mongering or you're a real downer or whatever. And Jeremiah, the situation is so similar. And I'm not saying that it's that we're going to be taken over and go into exile.
Yeah.
But I am saying that there's a pride in a people that say, that couldn't happen here. There's no way. Like, God loves us a lot. Like, how could that ever happen here? And Jeremiah is going, and there's this sort of conditional, and I said this in my sermon, and there's this was one of my, you know this when you're preparing for a sermon. Every now and then those things sneak in, and you're like, I never saw that before.
Yeah.
And I thought, there's a conditional prophetic word from the Lord, and then there's an unconditional prophetic word from the Lord. This word in Jeremiah starts off conditionally. If you change, if you turn, if you do something different, then I will relent. I will do this, or I will do that. But if you don't do that, then this is going to happen. And the message of Hosea is already like, it's too late.
Yeah.
The conditional is over. Exile is coming, and I'm telling you, here's the reasons why. Get ready, and here's how you turn to the Lord.
Yeah.
Jeremiah, he's got a foot in both doors. It's like it starts off conditionally, like you guys could turn at any point. It's like, I'm trying to remember the exact word.
Conditional part, you can find that all the way in the Torah. I don't remember which of the 5 books of Moses it's in, but
yes.
But when God is initiating His covenant with the people of Israel, He spells out exile.
Yes,
He says, if you do this, exile. If you don't, great.
Yes,
and
you can't say God didn't warn them. Yeah. Like Jeremiah is that last one. He's like, hey, I've been saying this for a long time. And the sort of like, when he says, return, O faithless sons, and I will heal your faithlessness. And in chapter 3, there is this like God's going, I want you to turn this around. And earlier he says this, and I love this language. He says, how I would set you among my sons and give you a pleasant land, a heritage most beautiful of all nations. And I thought you would call me my father and would not turn from following me. But surely as a treacherous wife leaves her husband, so have you been treacherous to me, O house of Israel, declares the Lord. And there's this it's the weeping prophet from Jeremiah, but you can sense the lament of the Lord too. Like, I was hopeful here, guys. Yeah. Like, I've done everything I can, and trust me, it hurts me immensely that you're going to go through exile. Like, and you could see that in an interesting way, the sort of heartfelt wrestling of the Lord. Like, I want to keep giving you grace, but there are things that you're doing behind the scenes, like child sacrifice and these things that you're not just dabbling with darkness anymore. Like you're fully going after darkness in a way that I can't let that stand anymore. And but that weeping prophet of Jeremiah is going like, please turn, please, like I please. And then eventually it's like, okay, this is happening. I've done enough now. I've given you enough warning. Now this thing is happening. Yeah.
A little bit of interesting archaeological side note there.
Yeah.
It's funny because actually, I've heard it's actually been interesting enough that it's popped up on some secular podcasts. I think I heard Joe Rogan wildly butchering an understanding of what was going on there. But in some of the northern Israel places of worship in Israel, just really fascinating parallel with what we see in the scripture, right? They found some altars to God that they found marijuana and cow dung residue on there.
Interesting.
And the reason for the cow dung is that in order to basically, you're getting it to burn hotter, which means you're almost certainly getting, you're releasing the THC. You're getting high from it.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, Joe Rogan and a few other people completely not understanding, having not really read the Bible, are like, see, look at that. They were using marijuana to worship God,
Yes.
Not understanding that the Bible's really clear about the fact that they're worshiping Yahweh, particularly in the north, in a way that is out of alignment, that they're doing divination. So they're using pharmaceuticals, they're using drugs to engage the spiritual realm in a way that is not prescribed by the Lord, that is prohibited by the Lord.
Yeah.
And so this is happening on a regular basis. I mean, it's happening all throughout. And it's just very interesting to see this little bit of information that we have in the New Testament about the high places and these altars that people are worshiping, and they're perverting the way they're worshiping God. And they've taken Asherah, and they claim that Asherah is the is the wife of God, and all this crazy, horrible, stuff that's just a perversion of mixing in with the nations around them. And then here we have archaeological evidence of that. But
interesting.
I mean, just a little tiny spice to what you're saying of what was taking place.
Well, and they are, and they're, and this is and it's very reminiscent of Hosea. But the Lord, his critique is not, hey, your pop culture has shifted. His critique is that the religious leaders are actually doing evil, and that's that line that's being crossed here. And in Jeremiah 8, he says, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. From prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have healed the wound of my people lightly, which I love that phrase. His people are wounded. And those that are in charge and their job is to help heal the people, they have healed the wound of my people lightly, so not fully. They're just putting a little Band-Aid on this deep wound. And they're saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. And this sort of, again, the pre-exile Jeremiah, and before we get into the post-exile Jeremiah, which is Jeremiah 29, but the pre-exile Jeremiah is battling these sort of false prophets that I think, in our current day, like we tend to pin false prophets on like calling back when Jesus is going to come back or something.
Yeah.
Like those are lines where you go, biblically, Jesus goes, nobody knows the day or the hour. So anybody who's like, this day Jesus is coming back, you could just pretty much take that prophecy and throw it out the window. So you could say that there are people that are fear-mongering, that they get a lot of TikTok views by going, this is we were just joking, the eclipse, and this is why all this stuff is going to happen. And but Jeremiah is, at the same time, I would say this too about pop culture Christianity. The thing that is most celebrated is, you're doing awesome. The Lord has great plans for you, which Jeremiah does say, but he says it after the exile. Like after they're like, oh, well, great. Well, my home's already been taken. I've lost all my wealth. Maybe I've lost members of my family. And now you're telling me like, you've got a great plan for me, It's in America, we're very tempted to, and I think just as humans, honestly, like you see the story of Jeremiah going, there are some difficult days ahead. And that the verse where and it's the book that I talked about with Eugene Peterson, Run with the Horses. It's such a great book. Free on Audible. I'll just say it again. I don't know. By the time you're listening to this, I don't know. If you're listening to this past 2024, I don't know if it's free anymore. But it is such a good book. Yeah. And Eugene Peterson talks so much about, like this is not the kind of peace that the Lord brings and that Jeremiah is talking about is very different than the kind of peace we talk about. Like the peace we talk about is avoid all the hard subjects, don't say anything that rocks the boat, And he's going, no, this is a hard-earned peace, the way that he says that. I'm like, what a great phrase. But it's this false sense of hope that the prophets are basically getting popular from. It's the same today. It's that sort of like, hey, you're fine. Everything's great. The Lord's awesome. Our best days are ahead. Like everything's going to be awesome. Those get applause lines. If you want to sit in front of people, and any of us who preach, we know like there's a temptation when you say something like that, or like America's not going anywhere. We're going to be just fine. People are like, yes, I want to applaud that. And the American version of Ryan, like I've said before, I want to applaud that. Great. Yeah, that would be awesome. But what is the Lord saying though? Yeah. And sometimes the Lord says something very different. And it's something that is not just for shock value. It's not just to poke at us because he hates America or something.
Yeah.
He's trying to get at the heart of people.
Yeah.
And sometimes he could do that with loving, tenderness and patience. And he is long-suffering, slow to anger, abounding in love, no doubt. Sometimes, though, and Eugene Peterson says this, sometimes we need exile to get our attention. Sometimes exile comes up and we go, oh, that is what we needed to do. And this is what's actually important. And sometimes God has to strip all the things that we think are important away so that we could really understand what's actually important. Yeah. And that is what exile is doing. And God's going, I'm not just cruel. I'm not just trying to like the proverbial kid in the sky, burning ants. Like, that's not what's happening here. He's going, I'm lovingly trying to get your attention. And sometimes the way that I do that is through exile and punishment.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that the Hebrew word for peace, when it says peace, but there is no peace. The Hebrew word picture for peace there essentially means to destroy the authority that establishes chaos. And so we think of peace as like lack of conflict. But when there is something in there that is causing chaos, regardless of whether or not there's current conflict, there's no peace, there's no wholeness, right? And so like for the nerds, who are listening, right? It's like in Lord of the Rings with Rohan, right? And you have Wormtongue is that kind of sneaky guy who's speaking to the king and convincing him to do all sorts of messed up things and turn his back really on the troubles of the world and what's going on, and just kind of ignore the evil that's growing outside of Rohan, and because he's deceptive and he's evil, and it's like, oh, we'll just kind of stay on our own, and we'll who cares what whether evil takes over outside.
It's not any of our business what's going on,
right? And I love the way they even portrayed in the movie a little bit up from the book of like, the king gets all old, and like there's like some kind of evil spell thing, that's negatively affecting him. And it's a great way of portraying just what lies in deception that saying peace, peace when there is no peace can do. But the truth is, for in that metaphor, right, for Rohan, there's no peace as long as, that guy, as long as Wormtongue is whispering in the ears of the king. You have to get rid of that before that's the case. And that's the state of Israel at that time before the exile, where you had these lying prophets who are whispering lies into the ears of, thank Tolkien for it,
But it's true, and they are, and they're whispering like, hey, it's just fine. Don't worry, just stick to yourself. Everything's okay.
And we got to be careful of that, right? Yes. We need to be careful of that across whatever group divides or whatever, even with, and maybe even especially within our own groups. Like, hey, are there those that we're associating with, that we're listening to, that we like to hear because they're saying peace, peace when there is no peace?
Yes.
And maybe the Lord says peace, the Lord loves peace, you know, but in order for there to be peace, we have to remove what's causing the chaos.
Yeah.
And
you could have prophets saying war when there is no war.
Yeah, exactly.
And it just depends on the times and seasons. This one, for whatever reason, this season feels a little bit more like the Jeremiah season. Yeah. Like, hey, we all sense it. Something's off, something's wrong. We know that. Yeah. And the Spirit of the Lord is alive in all of us who follow Jesus, and there's a continuity that happens there, and there's a continuity in people that have prophetic insight into what's happening. And so these seasons come up where you go, hey, actually, we should be on our guard in terms of watching the theologies that are coming in. We should watch what's hitting our kids. We should watch, there's those times where you're on a heightened alert. And this is just kind of one of those where you're just like, okay, Lord, what are you doing? What do I need to know about the season that we're in? Because I know it's consequential. I keep using that phrase, but I can't think of a better phrase for the season that we're in. It's consequential. Like, there's seasons where you're kind of coasting and you're like, hey, we're just kind of going along, going with the flow. And then there's seasons where you sense that there is there's something brewing, just like you said in that word picture with the Lord of the Rings, and Wormtongue's going, no, it's fine. Don't pay attention to it. It's okay. And it may placate you for a little while, but everybody is hitting this at some point, in the last few years of like, okay, something is not quite right.
Yeah.
And I could put my head in the sand and really hope it were different, or I can ask the Lord to make me different in how I interact with those things, and that's the key.
I think another issue that we face just as much, if not more, these days is also people. Voices saying, hey, that guy's the enemy.
Yes.
Forgetting that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but spirits and principalities, and making enemies of, political opponents or those who disagree with us or those who don't think this way or whatever, and not forgetting actually that those enemies are the ones we're called to pray for. Yes. Those are the ones we're called to love. And those are the ones that are the children of God that we're called to pursue and seek and love and care for. Yeah. And so I think there's that other thing of saying, hey, no, there is no peace and it's that guy's fault.
Yes.
As opposed to really cutting a layer deeper and saying, actually, it's that lie's fault. And there's a spiritual component, and that guy actually is partnering with that, and that's not good. But we love him, and we want to see him come to the truth. Yeah. It's a really really subtle but vital difference there.
It's like when you're looking at people that are like, okay, here's the conspiracy around us to destroy America or destroy whatever. I go, yeah. There's been a conspiracy going on since Genesis chapter 3. Like, yeah. Our enemy is our enemy. And of course he's orchestrating things to steal, to kill, and to destroy. Yeah. That's just always been his MO.
Do you think, can I interject really quick?
Yep. Sure.
Do you think I can interject? No. Do you think there's kind of because you just said something really interesting, like, we feel this in our cultural context in America. Do you think it's something that we should be doing as Christians to zoom out outside of our national, literal geographic context?
I think yes and no. Yes, obviously we're part of a kingdom that's much larger than America. We always have been. We're part of a kingdom that was started when Jesus, said, "On you, Peter, I will build my church." And from that point on, there was a new thing that was an offshoot of the old thing, but we're the body of Christ. There's something transcendent about that, At the same time, it is this interesting sort of nations. Nations were God's idea for whatever reason. There was this idea for nations, and when it was a Tower of Babel situation, God's like, I don't think this is good. There's something about the diversity of cultures, the diversity of nations that God deems good for some reason. And I think as we're in this season, like I said a few podcasts ago, there's an American version of me and then there's a Christian version of me. And I feel completely fine with that idea. This American version of me is I'm fine saying, man, I hope America gets her act together. I hope my kids get to enjoy the same things that I've gotten to enjoy. And I hope we get better at things in America. And I hope we, there's all sorts of things as an American that I just go, sometimes it's okay. Give yourself some permission to say, that's all right. I'm rooting for my country. I hope it goes well here. I really do. Jeremiah says it in chapter 29, pray for the welfare of your state or your nation or your city. And so there's something to that that's really, really beautiful. But the danger comes in is when all of your hope is anchored to the future of America and the future of whatever, the future of your bank account, the future of your relationships, the future of whatever it is. And this is, honestly, it's one of the things that the Lord says really clearly in here. I ended with Jeremiah 17 when he said, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord. And he talks about being a tree planted by, streams of living water. But he says, before that, he says, cursed is the man who trusts in man. He's like a shrub. I don't know why that word makes me laugh right now. He's like a little shrub.
Shrubbery.
Shrubbery. You're just mere shrubbery. But it's true. It's this sort of, and again, this fine line of going are you putting your trust in the systems of the world, which Babylon prophetically in so many ways, and Mark Buckley was very key in in telling me this is prophetically, Babylon just really represents the system of the world. When Isaiah says fallen is Babylon, there is this system of the world that gets built up, and at some point it becomes such an albatross that it has to fall. And it's the Tower of Babel over and over again.
Yeah.
We're really trying to build our own sort of utopia, and it doesn't work. And so the question is will those of us here in the West, and maybe primarily in America, and those of us who follow Jesus in America, will we see, can we see the system of the world fall and still trust God? Or is our faith so intertwined with the system of the world that when it falls, our trust in God falls too? And we go, if America fell, then who can, then I won't even believe in the Lord if he's going to allow something like this to happen.
I feel like that's more on the forefront of my mind only because of the recent eclipses and like you were saying, like you scroll TikTok and there's this like wildly like stretch of like the eclipses. Perfect visibility over every city in America called Nineveh or whatever, and I think the context of it's like there are the world exists, like there are other nations, like besides America and Israel, like that exist on the outside of our context. So I don't know, maybe it's that.
So, and my main point is this: like, of course, we're a bit preoccupied with the nation that we live in, and when I go to see the church in Ecuador, and they're like really proud to be Ecuadorian, I don't go, shame on you guys. You need to be like. I go, great. You could love Jesus and be proud of your country. That's fine. But I do think there is, in America, in our context, and clearly America does have influence over things in the world. And there's something that when you're a leader over something and you don't take that seriously, that you're held to a little bit different account. There's clearly some things pop culture wise and morally that we're leading. Like when I went to Ecuador, this is just a good example of this. Ecuador, they said, I was asking them, like, what are you guys going through? This was last year. Like, what's happening? And they said, well, with everything that's going on with transgenderism in America, it's being brought to Ecuador, and we don't know what to do with it. And a lot of our teachers are starting to teach things that we don't like. And we could talk about the finer points of that and what that means. But even completely outside of the politics of it, I had a moment where I was grieved, where I thought, and they were definitely looking at me like, you guys brought this here. Like, we didn't want this. Like, you've influenced this. Yeah. And they're right to say that. Like, of course they are. Like, we don't, you come out of a Gen X sort of world, real snarky about America, and just kind of naturally our knee-jerk reaction is to kind of talk down about America, and fine, and we're not perfect by any means, and I'm in that millennial Gen X, I got one foot in each generation, so I get it. Like there's a Gen X snarkiness in me too. But at the same time, when you see that happen, you go, gosh, I'm grieved. I wish Americans took this more serious. I wish that we understood before we just go, forget it, America, it sucks. Of course we're stupid, I wish we took it seriously and said, gosh, what could we do to not influence the world this way? And by influence the world, by no means am I saying we're superior by any means. And just a leadership position. Yeah. And some nations, there were times where France was the influencer on the world, and there were times where England was the influencer on the world, and we all saw that, and that shifts and changes. And maybe we're in a season where it's shifting and changing away from us, but before that happens, we're kind of leaving a bad mark morally, Well, it's, I don't know if any of that answers your question.
I mean, I think
Dalton. I don't know.
It's good to step back and even look at those things when you do see, is there a waning of our influence? And if there is that necessarily a bad thing? When you see
influence, you're like, I kind of hope it does wane. Yeah. I kind of hope we stop influencing everybody with what we're doing, because it's not healthy.
And I think when you try to do your best puny little job of looking through the Lord's perspective, it might be helpful to even see that, right? Yeah. Like if there's anything I've learned ever being in any leadership or in charge of things with multiple people, it's like sometimes what no one else understands when they come to you and complain about the decision you made or the way you ran things is they're looking at their piece of the puzzle. And as the leader, you're looking at their piece and their piece and their piece and their piece of the puzzle. Yeah. And you're realizing the way these all fit together, unfortunately, it's not going to be what you want for your piece of the puzzle that's going to be best for the whole thing. Yeah. And I think the Lord, it's understandable that we would be grieved when things are shifting and changing in America and on the global scale, maybe there's a waning of our influence and the Lord knows in his sovereignty, what nation to set up when and what nation to bring down when and to what extent. And I don't think you or I are making any prophetic claims right now. No. But we're saying, hey, well, we see what's happening and we see that the Lord is sovereign and that he's good and that we want to we'll talk about this a little bit later. We want to seek the welfare of this city. We want to seek the welfare of the culture and the world around us, the place that God has placed us. Yeah. But our security is not in that because we're part of the kingdom of heaven. And the vision, we actually won't get to it in Daniel. When we do Daniel, we'll kind of just do the first half. But there's that vision in the book of Daniel of this statue that represents all the empires of the world. And then this boulder comes flying out of nowhere and smashes it. Yeah. And that boulder is the kingdom of heaven that smashes the empires of the world. And that's what Jesus came to establish is this kingdom that just demolishes the empires and is greater than all of them.
Yes. And it is interesting. I mean, pulling it back to Jeremiah, there's a scary turn that happens in Jeremiah from the conditional prophetic word to the unconditional. And I would say this, like the conditional word is, hey, pray for Israel, pray for Jerusalem, because she can still make the right choice. Mm-hmm. And pray that she tears down the idols, pray that she walks away from darkness. Pray that she stops chasing after other gods and other idols, and that she returns to the Lord with her whole heart, Then the unconditional word comes in, and this is, honestly, this is one of the craziest verses I feel like in the Bible, where you go, holy moly. But the Lord says to Jeremiah in chapter 14, he says, do not pray for the welfare of this people. He's like, stop praying. Like, we've now made a different shift. And I'm telling you, God's going, this thing is coming. And now I have a different message for you. And that's where Jeremiah 29 comes in. But there's this shift moment that happens in the nation where he says, stop praying. He said, though they fast, I will not hear their cry. These are things that happen occasionally in the Bible, and you read them in the prophetic. Yeah. Like, I love that Abraham Heschel word, and he's like, the voice of the prophet gives voice to the silent agony of the world. I was like, what a great line. But there's that, like, we want grace. We get applause when we talk about grace. We want love. We get applause when we talk about love. Is the gospel filled with grace and love and mercy? 100%. Absolutely. But there is a justice part of God that is exerted on nations and on people that I believe is still happening. It's not a just only pre-Jesus situation. But when God says this, it's his perfect, it's his justice coming in. And the thing that we don't understand is like, and probably the people at this time didn't understand, is he's going, I see the end game here. Where you're heading is so dark and so despicable that I have to put an end to it. Yeah. So he goes, Jeremiah, please stop praying that this thing won't happen anymore, because now it's going to happen. And he says, though they fast, I will not hear their cry, and though they offer burnt offering and grain offering, I will not accept them. But I will consume them by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. And you're going, oh my gosh, this thing is coming. And then one of the prophets says, and then he says, one of your prophets says to them, you shall not see the sword. You shall not have famine, but I will give you assured peace in this place. This is one of the prophets is saying this. And the Lord said to me, the prophets are prophesying lies. And there is this sort of sobering moment. And I think this is not a unique to this moment in history thing. You know, you just see this cycle in history. It is sort of the Tower of Babel's cycle, where it's like we're building. We think nothing can touch us. And then the Lord's like, hey, I've got something to keep you humble.
Yeah.
And not because he's a mean God or he's just a harsh taskmaster trying to make you act right. He's going, look, for whatever reason, you have to trust me that this is the loving move. Like, I have to put an end to this thing, you know? And there is that grace of the Lord in Jeremiah 29 that comes around, you know? But I think that when you read Jeremiah, it's like, we love to just skip to the, like, I have, you know, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Like, we want to jump there, you know, like pre-exile, we want to jump there. Like, we want to jump there the whole time. And I understand that, like, that makes people happy. And, you know, like, I felt that on Sunday. I'm like, I'm so sorry. Like, I wish, I saw Tim Keller one time. He got up in front of everybody and he said, I just want to apologize ahead of time. He said, worship was so good. And we were like celebrating, and he said, we were singing, and he said, it was so joyful. And he says, I do not have a joyful message I'm bringing this morning, and I'm so sorry ahead of time, you know. And that is the pastoral heart that's coupled with the prophetic heart. That's like, I want to tell you really good stuff. I really wish I was here to tell you good stuff. But I have some hard things to tell you that will lead you to good stuff. You know, because God's never pointless with this. It's not like I'm just trying to drag you through the mud. He's like, I got something good on the other side of this, but I'm telling you, I can't let this stand, and justice has to come through at this point. Yeah. And there were enough of the children and widows, and there was enough injustice in the land. And God talks about that in Jeremiah, going, you are turning your head to some dark, dark, dark things that are going on. Yeah. And I think before we cast aspersions on them, are we doing that here? You know, like, are we turning a blind eye to some things that are really terrible? Because we're just like, I can't deal with it, or it's kind of impacting the comfort level of my day-to-day, you know? And to some extent, we're all somewhat guilty of that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really important to say is oftentimes when we're talking about prophecy, even just the manifestation of the Spirit, even here and now, even just within your community, right? Sometimes there's a good warning that, hey, like, prophecy is meant to edify. It's meant to build up the church. Yeah. But I think it's worth noting that doesn't mean that part of the edification process is not sometimes also conviction. Yeah. Is not also, because I mean, we certainly see that throughout the Old Testament. There's so much, because the role of a prophet is to make straight the way of the Lord. Yes. Yeah. And so making straight the way of the Lord means a lot of conviction sometimes. Now, on the other side, prophecy is not only, hey, you're going down, the Lord's coming to smite you. Everybody's. I think you have a story shared about someone on your DTS. I think you shared it on the podcast.
You're all going to die.
Someone said you were all going to die.
None of that happened.
No, it didn't.
Well, and it's all the people on TikTok that get a lot of views going, the world's going to end in 8 minutes, and then they get 1 million views, and then they do it again 2 weeks later. Yeah. Which sadly desensitizes us to, or even, you know, what we're talking about with the eclipse or something.
It dilutes real prophecy. It dilutes
real things. So, like, even Jesus said, there are signs in the heavens. So it's okay to, like, see an eclipse and go, man, Lord, are you trying to get our attention? Yeah. But it's sad because it's diluted by all the people that are they're like, oh, it's going through all the baloney, you know, all these cities. They're like trying to, like, draw connections where you're just like, I don't know.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because there's something that we spent a fair amount of time talking about 3 or 4 years ago. And to be honest, it felt to me like a clarification of something I'd been uncomfortable about for a while, of like, no, that's off, right? And so particularly what I'm talking about is, you know, back in 2020, there were a lot of people in the Christian world, particularly in the charismatic world, so a vein that you know, we're tapped into. And there's a handful of people in the charismatic world that are kind of established prophetic voices in, I don't want to quite say a celebrity, but maybe and and I don't even mean that in a derogatory sense, but maybe a bit here, to be honest, but people that a lot of people listen to and recognize as prophetic voices.
Yeah.
A lot of those people who have a big following, who write a lot of books, who speak at a lot of seminars, were saying, hey, the Lord is telling me that Trump is going to win in 2020.
Yes.
And then he
guess
didn't.
what? Yeah.
And
totally.
some of those people, a few of them, to their credit, said, I was wrong. I need to go figure out some stuff.
Yes.
You know, a lot of those people dug in their heels, and they're still out there, you know, with the platform of a prophet, and they wiggled their way around, or just kind of let it fade in, you know, fade out.
There's always the people when times are uncertain. The false prophets prey on the vulnerabilities of the people, and they prey on the longings of their heart. So when somebody hears something like, and to take away Donald Trump from it, but just, you know, like in general, you hear the prophecy again, like what Jeremiah was going through, like, your nation's going to be great. Everything's going to be awesome. We're going to continue to be on the top of the heap. They're preying on the longings of the people, but they're not really seeking the Lord. Yeah. And I think there was enough people doing that. And I'll say, I won't make it neat and tidy. Like, some of the people, I feel like they were pretty repentant and said, you know what, I misheard. I can have grace for people who mishear and are repentant about it. It doesn't mean that I'm going to trust the words they say in the future. Yeah,
that's a really good point.
And so it's like, okay, great, you misheard from the Lord. I'm not going to condemn you. It's between you and the Lord. But in the back of my mind, I got to ask, well, what did you miss? And do you have enough people in your life going like that you're bouncing things off of? Are you getting sucked up in the hype of things going on in social media, and you've got friends giving this prophetic word, and you're like, yeah, I want to like what was that motivation? Because it wasn't the Spirit of God. Like, we could all say that. Like, we all know if it was accurate, then if it was inaccurate, God won't tell you an inaccurate prophetic word. Yeah. So there is a level of caution, and I think there was a proper refining. So for people maybe in the more, which I guess I'd put myself in that camp a bit.
I think, well, depending on what you mean by that, I would say I think there ought to have been, and hopefully there was. Part of my concern is maybe enough of too much of that just kind of, like I said, got brushed off, and people kept moving and are pretending it never happened. Yeah.
Well, it did a sneaky thing, and this is the danger for the prophetic, for the prophetic voice, for the person who feels like they've got a prophetic calling on their life. Great. But you have a responsibility, because there might be people that hear your prophetic word and then it doesn't happen. And then their disillusionment causes them to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. And there's a lot of, maybe hyper-reformed people that have experienced that. Yeah. An abuse of...
Not to mention people who've just walked away from the Lord altogether.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what you mean.
Yes, exactly. So there's an abuse of a prophetic gifting that causes people to go, maybe the whole thing is crap. Maybe the whole thing is wrong. And if you have prophetic insight, I mean, I just think there's a lot of people that are just a little too flippant about it, you know? And now I'm always a fan of the prophetic. I really am. And I do think there is something very powerful in it. But it can be abused like anything else. Can the pastoral gifting be abused? 100%. Can the evangelist abuse their giftings and water their message down to the point where they get a lot of responses and they feel really good about themselves? Totally. So every gifting has a shadow side and a temptation that's outside of the realm of how you should use your gifting. So I try really hard never to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But for the public prophet, I'm just a little skeptical of the public prophet, to be honest, these days. I think inside the context of a church, beautiful. Give voice to the prophet, and sift it as a church. Yeah. But when you're not in relationship with somebody and somebody just kind of pot shots a prophetic word, it could feel really good to be like, oh man, things are about to do this or that. And some of those people are doing that knowingly, and it's sad. So I'm in a season of like, hey, be wary of that.
Yeah.
Listen to prophetic voices, to people who you know their names and you can go to their house. Like, it's probably better to like have that sort of accountability on the prophet. Be careful if you are a prophetic voice, and be careful not to jump on social media. Like I've been really off of social media recently for that very reason. Like I don't want to jump on there and say, maybe the Lord's saying this when maybe he's not saying that. Like I don't even want to risk it at this point, you know? So there's a part of this season is the Lord is asking us to raise our bar and standard for a lot of those things, not just for the prophet, but for the people receiving the prophecy, and how quick you are to receive from somebody. We need, and I said this is really the last point of my sermon this week, but you need that discernment. Yeah. And like the Jeremiah 29, you know, like when he's talking about, you know, these are the things, the letter to the exiles after they're in exile. He says, look, and I took a shot at, and it's so funny because I said this third service. I said that I'm a closet prepper, but I'm like, I can't be a closet prepper in front of all these people. I broke the number one rule of prepping is telling people that you prep.
Yeah, if it all comes down, I'm going to your house.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So I will throw this caveat. I think you could be prepared as a human being for, especially if you have a family and you have kids, like it's wise, just like it is to put savings in your account for retirement. You know, do things happen? Yeah. And prepping, I think, in a healthy sense, is not a lack of trust in the Lord. It's just a lack of trust in the system of the world. So it's not a lack of trust in the Lord. So it can be. But for some people, it's like, hey, I just want to make sure my family, if something happens, I'm prepared.
I noticed Costco sells buckets of like, you know, Kirkland MREs these days, so you can't be the only one.
It sells really well. Really well.
There's also ads on like Fox News for like a doomsday bucket.
Have the doomsday bucket.
I don't see a lot of those.
Brent's like, I got 3.
I got some. They're not bad.
I'm just saying, like, I don't see a lot of those anywhere else. That's not on conservative TV.
I would say this. I think this is outside of prophecy, and you know, I think it's wise to be able to feed your family for at least a couple of weeks, just in case something happens. That is something that in Arizona we're like, I don't know. If you're in Alabama, if you're in Florida, people are like, oh yeah, sometimes we get hit by hurricanes and we don't have power for a long time. So I will say, if you're not emptying your entire savings account and you're going into debt for it, if you're just occasionally putting some stuff aside just in case, fine. But if your ultimate goal is, I want a bunker that I'm by myself in, and I sit and my nails get long and my beard gets long, and I'm going to hang out there for 5 years. I'm being a bit facetious, but you know what I'm saying? Like, the people like, you got to be able to hunker down for like 8 years, and you're going, at what point, you know, like, really, you know.
Just let the zombies get you.
Yeah, at that point, just let them have their snack. But there is something about this that can be really unhealthy when it completely separates you from community. And what Jeremiah says here is like, he's like, hey, when you're in exile, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Like, there's something that feels so good about just even saying that. Take wives, have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons. Give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. Shemaiah is a false prophet that comes in afterward, and he's like, don't listen to Jeremiah. Like, do not put your roots down in Babylon. We're going home any minute now, you know? And in some ways, in a spiritual sense, you feel that in America. Like, hey, don't get comfortable here. We're going back to fully revived Christian America, which I don't even know if that was ever the case in history anyway. Or you see, kind of like Jeff Goki will talk about, like the unhealthy getting ready for the Lord coming back sort of mindset that happened in the 70s and 80s, where people stopped having kids, they stopped getting houses, you know, they just stopped doing everything because they're like, any minute God's going to come back. And this advice right here should stop us in our tracks and go, no. Like, we don't know what's coming. You're right. And it could get really bad. It could get really bad.
Yeah.
But don't stop living your life. Like, get a house, plant a garden, enjoy it. Like, raise your kids, have grandkids, you know, like get into the culture that you're in, because what else are you going to do? And it's this beautiful advice to people who, you know, they don't want to do that. They're like, I'm in exile. I don't want to do that. I don't want this new home to be my home.
Yeah.
Like, that's painful advice for them, because they're like, I want to go back to my old home. Like, I like that better than this new one. And Jeremiah's like, no. Just take a deep breath. Live where you're at. And get a house, plant a garden. You know, there's something so beautiful about that. Then he jumps forward. He says, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile.
Can we back up a little more slowly here? Because I actually think this letter is so key to the central theme of this of this series, right? We're talking about you know, strange land. How do we live in exile? That was our working title for the series before we came up with a prettier, cooler sounding strange land with the Dune 2 nod.
Which I love, Dalton.
Great job, Dalton. But how do we live in exile? And this is literally a letter that God had composed to be sent to the people of Israel when they were just getting in exile, saying, how do we live in exile? What do we do? And so if we're feeling, which we are not, we're not been kidnapped,
exile.
You know, and torn across the world, to live in Babylon. That's not the case. But you know, I don't think we need to sell you on how it resonates with us.
Sure.
Right.
Yep.
And so,
and that's that Jeremiah verse. And like I said, before I get into this, because I'm going to dive in a little bit more, but if you don't recognize the spiritual exile you're in, you won't really read this letter. Like, if you don't really recognize it, like these people, for the people who didn't recognize their exile, even though they were physically removed from their homes and they were put into a new kingdom, the false prophets going, no, don't listen to Jeremiah. We're going to go back any minute now. And it's kind of that, you know, if you can't run with men, what makes you think you could run with horses? Which is that idea that God's going, look, Jeremiah, pre-exile, if you're having a really hard time now, you're going to have a very hard time later. Like, you think now is hard, wait until the later season comes, you know? And that's the preparation for when you are in exile. Then you could read this letter and it actually is good news. Instead of you going, no, but wait, hold on. Like, maybe we could just go back to where we were. No matter what is coming in the future of America or whatever, we're not going to go backwards. We can't ever go backwards. That's just, we're going to move forward into something. And this letter is telling them, you're in exile, but you can move forward. Like, let me just calm your heart a little bit and say, this is how you move forward.
You know, speaking of prophecy and moving forward, not back, a few years back, I had one of those dreams that was clearly a dream from the Lord, and for some really specific things that aren't worth getting into, because it's just is a whole bag of worms, right? But part of this, in this dream, I was on a beach, and this kind of World War II era prop plane came and was shooting the beach, you know, with artillery or whatever, rail guns, and I dove into a tide pool for cover. And one of the elements that the Lord revealed to me as I was thinking and praying and talking about this and passing it, you know, chatting with other people for interpretation afterwards, there was a lot of other stuff, that really intense, crazy stuff in that dream that has since happened. But one of the key takeaways was, part of the interpretation was, you know, I dove into this tide pool for cover. And what the Lord revealed was that tide pool was representative of what the Lord had done. But what I ought to have done, even though I was okay and there was some safety in that tide pool, the real safety was, you know, just 20 feet the other direction, jumping into the ocean. And I think what the Lord was telling me specifically in that was, you know, don't go find cover when all this stuff goes down in what I have done. Go find cover in what I'm doing next.
Yes.
In the ocean. And so I think I just, even as we were talking about, like, that's worth sharing here. I think, let's not find cover in what we're missing.
Yes.
And and even I think it's the Ecclesiastes. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I think it's in Ecclesiastes, somewhere in the Old Testament, one of the books of wisdom, where it says it's not wisdom to speak about, like, oh, how great were the days gone by.
Yes.
Like, that's actually a foolish thing to do.
Yes.
But rather, let's seek the cover in what the Lord is doing, and what the Lord is doing is moving forward. And so this letter, I love that it's practical advice. And so for you and for me and for people listening, right, who are feeling like, hey, we're followers of Jesus, we missed the day when we had clout. And we fear the day that we see coming, that seems to be maybe coming, but who knows, maybe a revival, I don't know. But we fear what we see on the horizon and what has come to meet us a little bit, where actually Christians, people take us to court for the fact that we're standing on what we really do believe the Lord is telling us, where it's actually, we're told we're the immoral ones for doing, and not just because for the moments when we've actually been immoral and failed, but we're told we're immoral for actually following Jesus.
Yeah.
For loving enemies, praying for those who persecute us. We're told that is immoral, for telling people that they can be forgiven, for telling people to repent, that these things we're told are immoral.
And there's little pops of that. You see in Canada, things are like the hate speech laws. In Europe too, things are popping up.
We fear our public schools. They don't feel like safe places to send
even
our kids.
Recently, the last couple of years, we've seen like FBI agents arrest people who are praying at abortion centers, and so you're going there are little inklings of it. Now, we're not getting dragged into jail, but we're definitely sensing.
Even right here, Washington School District, the district right next to us, about a year ago, they broke, and I don't know what happened to the story since then, but they had a long-standing deal with Arizona Christian University for student teachers coming out of their program. They had never had any problems. Only actually they'd hired some people from that. If I remember correctly, I could be wrong on that detail. But the long-standing good relationship, student teachers from ACU. Well, the Washington School District decided to break that agreement, and they came out and they said it explicitly. They said, we don't think these people are safe because. Essentially because they're Christian. And so we don't want student teachers coming from the Christian university. I mean, that's shocking,
and, totally.
And I understand in their worldview that makes sense because,
and we have to say these things because I think, so I used an analogy on Sunday that I feel like has grown in my mind, What's funny is it just hit me in the moment. I didn't have it in my notes, but I thought, if you have cancer and you go to your doctor and your doctor's like, you're fine. Things are just fine. But he knows you have cancer and you go home, like, we all agree that is cruel. Like, that is not hope. That's not good. That's not. And for that person who's not feeling well or they know something's wrong, to hear that somebody say, oh, you're fine, is not actually good news either. When you're like, I know something's wrong. And if somebody says cancer, you're like, well, at least I know what's wrong, and there is this acknowledgement of, hey, there is something wrong here. But I thought about it even more, like you look at Jeremiah 29, if you don't know you have a problem and God's giving you the solution, you're going to be like, why are we doing that? So let's say the doctor, I'm going to keep the analogy going. Let's say the doctor knows you have cancer and says, hey, you're just fine. I want to put you through chemo, though, just in case. You'd be like, no. No, thank you. I'm fine. And like, we don't want that medicine if we don't have to take it, And it's just almost like immediately after, like they literally get mad at Jeremiah for saying, because Jeremiah says, look, in this, he's like, build houses, do all of this. I have good plans for you, says the Lord, all the things that we really want to hear. Nestled in this word is the word that they didn't want to hear. And he said, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you. And they're like, all of a sudden now freaking out. They're like, 70 years?
Yeah.
Jeremiah, again, get this guy out of here. Like, we're going back soon, you know, like, let's be positive about this, you know. And Jeremiah is like, this is what the Lord is saying. Yeah. But the medicine, if you don't know you're in exile for 70 years, the medicine doesn't seem right. You're like, that doesn't seem right. I shouldn't take that medicine. But God's going, no, I'm giving you the medicine that you need for the sickness that you have. Like, you're in exile, and you're going to be here for a while.
So with that, right, like that's what, now that we've like got our anxiety running a little bit, right? But I think here's the thing.
Everybody.
No, I think this is good and on purpose, right? Because like we talk about this, people think about this. So you see that, you know, every podcast or whatever, you know, they're thinking about, oh, things are changing and shifting and uncomfortable and this and that and whatever. And there's all these solutions and more than even solutions, there's just the gut reaction, right?
Yeah.
But what we're doing here, very on purpose in this series, is let's see what the Bible says. And so here, Jeremiah 29, one of the first things that God says in this exact scenario, or in a scenario that at least resonates with where we're at, is build houses, live in them, plant gardens, and eat their produce.
Yeah.
Keep moving.
Yeah.
And prosper, right? Like you don't plant a garden for next week.
Yes.
You know, you plant a garden for at least months to come. But honestly, you know, if you're planting trees, we're talking years. We're waiting to see. We put this little tree and we're not going to get fruit for 2-3 years.
Yep.
You know, 4 or 5 years. And then in 10 years, it's going to be like a little guy that gives us a little shade. In 20-30 years, we're going to have something significant. And so what is the Lord saying to us if we're feeling in exile? We'll build your house.
Yes.
Build your house.
And multiply.
And plant some gardens. And I would extend this even to say, maybe literally, too. like actually maybe legitimately, maybe there is something to say for the stability of building a house, having a place that can be a place of refuge. That's your little place where people can come into your home, to your house, and they can see something that is different from the world outside, and maybe literally plant a garden. There's something pretty key about garden that we see through and through and through the scriptures. I mean, we see science saying, actually affirming this too, right? Plant a little garden is actually it's up there almost with exercise as far as your you know, anxiety and stress. It's like, you know, you're feeling pretty stressed because you just got, you know, stolen and kidnapped across the world. Maybe go plant a garden.
Yes.
And if you're feeling...
and even the multiply thing, it's like, have kids.
Yes, that's the next
And then
bit.
have grandkids. Like, it's kind of like you know what? Just dig in here.
Yep.
Like, live your life, enjoy it, have kids,
have sons, have daughters, take wives.
Yes, and then let them take wives. You know, there's a vision for a multi-generation of not hunkering down and waiting for things to change.
Yeah.
It's what do I have right now? And this is a very godly, this is a very Jesus-like thing. This is a very like, what do you have but right now? And just live your life.
And you talked about in a sermon some months ago, right? What was the particular statistic of you know, when I think it was in your parents, or it was even specifically your dad goes to church, the higher probability.
Yes, I don't remember the exact numbers, but when a father goes to church, in particular, I think it's maybe like a Father's Day thing, or maybe I was at Men's Retreat potentially.
I don't remember.
But there's something really important.
It was Men's Retreat.
Men's Retreat. There we go. Something really important about dads going to church. Nothing against moms at all. But there's statistically something about kids seeing their dads engage in the stability of
and it was something significant, something like 80% or something.
Very
significant. You know, of people
it's
who are coming to
50,
church, their dad was too, right?
Yep. And if both parents are active, then that goes way up.
Yeah.
So not just, hey, we attend occasionally, but both your parents care about Jesus. They're active in the church. Chances are the next generation.
And my point here is that one of the things in our culture around us is this message of kids are a burden. They're really not fun. They're going to ruin your life. You and your significant other should run around, have fun, be travel vloggers, you know, all the way into your 90s.
Yeah, what's that weird acronym going around right now? They're like young married with no kids or something.
Dual dinks.
Dual
income, no kids, right?
Dual income, no kids, yeah.
That's the dream. That's so wonderful, you know. And it's funny, actually, my wife and I, she watches a bunch of travel vloggers and stuff, and there's one particular couple who, doesn't have kids, and you're like, I don't know why you don't, because they clearly would be great parents, and they clearly kind of want to, but they've decided not to, I think, because they make their money traveling the world. Yeah. And it's funny, we had our first kid, 14 months ago, and we did some world traveling. I mean, you guys did that too, right? And sitting on this side, it's like, yeah, all those people who regret not spending their 20s running around traveling the world because they had kids, they did. Traveling the world's great, but they didn't miss much. And all those people who are out there in their 30s and 40s and 50s still traveling the world with no kids, they've missed out. Yeah. And so we got to start saying really loudly and really clearly, having kids is wonderful. Yeah. And if you want to see and you bemoan the change in the culture around us, walking away from Jesus, walking away from relationship with God, well, the relationship you have the most discipling influence over by far is your children.
Yes,
and
for sure.
Maybe we could have a revival by multiplication that is just discipling our children. Maybe we ought to be having more kids in the world around us. Yeah. Maybe we ought to be adopting more kids in the world around us. Maybe we ought to be taking this literally. And it's
an affront to the sort of fast-paced nature of like, let's just get this thing done. Like, this is slow stuff. Yeah. Have kids.
Yeah.
Have grandkids.
Yes.
Like there's something.
Term.
Yes. And it is. Of course, I would say it's a part of the enemy's call to steal, kill, and destroy is to tell people, you'll be a lot happier if you don't have kids.
Yeah.
And God says literally in here, multiply there.
Multiply there and do not decrease. And it's really interesting.
Not decrease.
When we watch even, statistically, one of the interesting things that you hear people talking about these days is overpopulation, and now people are saying, actually, wait, that's not going to be a problem because what happens is, as societies, what we've seen over the last century or so is, as societies hit a certain point, economically speaking, their population decreases, and so will probably level out. And so you see this in places really acutely like Japan and Europe, where it's like we're running into major problems, and Europe is saying, great, our solution is let's bring everyone here, and just from all over the world, and that'll maybe keep us afloat a little bit, and it's causing all sorts of tumult for them. And so the population, so it says, don't decrease but multiply. And so maybe as the world around us is decreasing because they've bought the lie that children are not valuable, that they're not good, that they're a drain, that when they're not born yet they're a parasite, that all this nonsense. Maybe we could just quietly be having kids and loving our families and
well, and you can attest to this. It's like, I've done a lot of traveling in my life, been to a lot of different countries. It's wonderful and great. It pales in comparison to me having kids. It's just a totally different thing. I would never go, gosh, you know what? Instead of having my kids, I should have just traveled a lot more. Like, it wouldn't even cross my mind. Like, it was, once you have kids, you're like, you're in a totally new thing.
No one's saying you can't do both either.
No, you can do both.
Sure.
I think it's like ironic,
we're taking our kid to Indonesia in 3 weeks.
It's ironic.
We took our kids to Peru.
The binary of like, one thing that I thought about, I newly have 2 kids. One of the things that I thought was going to greatly your time management shifts, your priorities shift, that's for sure. But you can absolutely do stuff with your children. You might have to modulate the style or there are things that shift, but I think that's, I mean, and I'm not, there are Mormons that are like, no, we literally we will have as many kids as we possibly, my body will possibly let me have, the life we get. But I think that as absolutely something that shifted my perspective having kids.
Yeah, it's definitely not a binary choice. It's not but I think it's a lie from pop culture that's like, oh, if you have kids, it's like the worm tongue whispering in your ear going, if you have kids and you can't do anything cool anymore, your life is over, they're super expensive,
and the world's going downhill, so it's unresponsible, and all these
which I would say leaks into maybe even more the conservative Christian families and some of the people, just like I was saying with Jeff Goki talking about people who are like, Jesus is coming back any day, so let's not have kids. this is a different vision of life, you know?
Yeah.
And I love right after this, he says, seek the welfare of the city.
Third one. So build houses, have kids, seek the welfare of the city.
Seek the welfare of the city. So, you know,
And this is Babylon we're talking about. Seek the welfare of Babylon.
Yes.
The whore of Babylon.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Totally. As if God had nothing to say about Babylon.
Yeah.
This is not like moving into a more moral society. Mm-hmm. There's even more of a stark contrast and probably more of a temptation to do more of the things that got them into Babylon to begin with.
Yeah, it says pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare.
And that line, that's one I wish I could have unpacked more on Sunday.
Unpacking now.
Yes,
deep dive.
Yes. So and this is exactly what we were just saying. You're seeking the welfare of the city, and you will find your own welfare in that too. And the word welfare is shalom. You'll find your own peace.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Really cool.
So you'll find your own peace when you're seeking the peace of the city that you're in. And so there's this sort of like you're seeking the best for it. I want the best for this place that I'm in. And I think a lot of people, again, they bemoan what's happening in a culture, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what do we do?" You know, and of course, here they are in Babylon, right? They are outnumbered and things are bad in that culture. And God's going, look, if you change, your city will start to change too. Mm-hmm. Like there is this big idea that like tends to make us so overwhelmed. And he's like, look, get a house, plant a garden, have kids, pray for the welfare of the city. And you will find your own welfare in that too, because they're interlinked with each other. Mm-hmm. And as you have this multiplying culture of people who find their delight in the Lord and have their delight in, you know, in their family and things that are just really beautiful, it speaks to the welfare of the entire city and to the entire nation that seems so lost and so broken. And we read about this later in Daniel and all of these things where the people of God eventually move their way up to the point where they're influencing this culture, no doubt, you know. And God's going, look, it may seem insurmountable. And you may want to like what he's not saying in here is organize a coup to push back against them and then
undermine,
get back to
cut him down in the Achilles heel.
Yes, and get back to Jerusalem. He's going, look, you gotta hunker down here, and you gotta really commit to being there, and seeking the welfare and that deeper idea of going, look, I'm not looking for vengeance on these people. I'm not hoping that God does something really, like he doesn't say in here, he's not saying yet, like, this is what I'm going to do to Babylon. That does come.
Yeah.
But right now, he doesn't give them that information. He goes, look, lock down. You're going to be there for 70 years. And then he says, I will visit you. Like, what does that mean? What is that? Are we freed? No, he says, I'm going to visit you at that point. And then he says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare, shalom, and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. And the people, you know, have just felt this deep, deep wound of exile. And God's going, look, just lock in there. And they've got to be going, I don't want to, you know? Yeah. And he's going, I want you to, because it's going to be good for you, because I actually have good plans for you. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a few generations. You that got exiled, you're not going to see it. But I have some good things for the next generations that are coming up. But you're not going to see the things that you're hoping to see, but you will see some good in the land that you're at in exile. And that's, I think, for the hope of us in this season. It's like, if you think nothing good can happen in this culture, I think there's that fine line between saying, hey, God doesn't love these things that's going on in our culture. Absolutely, that's true. But if you found yourself kind of like silently rooting for their demise just because you're mad at the culture, you're missing the heart of God. Like, that's not what he's asking you to do. Like, seek the welfare of the place that you find yourself. Yeah. Like, that is... It's not a negotiable thing. And actually, you'll find your own welfare. What he's saying is, look, I know you don't want to do this, but if you do it, I'm going to give you what you need in this culture. And so I think a lot of us, like when we're feeling that way, you might feel this sort of visceral, like, I don't want to pray for this. Or, maybe the old school, and I do think it's old school at this point, the like Republicans, Democrats, and like, I'm not going to pray for the other side. Like, no. Like that's what we're supposed to do, And when we see the brokenness of our culture, we're not supposed to root for more brokenness. Yeah. We're called to root for its welfare.
Let's tiptoe onto some thin ice for a little bit.
Like we haven't been.
And and
Dalton's like, I won't even publish this.
Maybe let's try to talk about some specifics, and to be careful before we get into this, right? Like, so we read Jeremiah 29 and try to interpret that in the context of that and try to see how that might apply to us here and now. That's pretty solid, right? Pretty countercultural, pretty scary, going to rub us the wrong way, but like, we're reading the Word of God.
Yeah.
Let's, you and me, like I said, jump out on the thin ice for a little bit and talk about like, well, how could we seek the welfare of the city, of the culture around us, of Phoenix? What are some thoughts? I mean, so I'm curious some thoughts of yours, but just to get the ball rolling on it. I mean, one of the things that I think is really poignant, and I like the discussion we've been having behind the scenes, and I think maybe from the pulpit a little here and there, I don't know, particularly about school, right? So like, we know things just feel very different. Not everybody, but many people have chosen to say, I'm not comfortable with what's happening in the public schools, and I love my kids, and I'm going to pull them out. I love the way you framed that, to just say, hey, it feels, and I think you've done this before on podcasts or whatever, of saying, hey, it felt to us like one thing to ask our kids to stand firm in the midst of pressure from their peers, but when it's talking about the adults here, I don't know, we got it. We're going to pull them out of that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we want to seek the welfare of the city, right?
Yes.
And so we actually still love the public schools that a lot of people have pulled their kids out of.
Yeah.
And we love the kids and the families in there. And we love the teachers and the administrators there. And so I think one of the drums that David has been beating a little bit, which I really love, is like, let's start Christian schools.
Yeah.
And let's do Young Life better than we've ever done it before, and add to those tools.
I think there's the people that are called into public schools that
Young
really
Life,
need
by
to
the way, is
there.
Ministry, not always just in public schools, but
so it's
evangelistic outreach to high school students.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. And I think there are people, I've talked to a few teachers here in our church that they feel very called to the public school system. And I go, great. It's not easy, for sure.
Yeah.
You're going to be fighting some hard battles, and you're going to see some sad things. My mom is one of them. My mom's in a public school. She's a counselor in a public school. She's being told you can't say, boys and girls. And she's just kind of like, at this point, ignoring that and just kind of going, hey, but she's taking care of kids that are hurting. She's absolutely doing that, and it's beautiful. I love that, and it's a very difficult thing. I will say at the same time, putting your kids in Christian school, I don't think would be not seeking the welfare of the culture. It's just more of a.
You mean you don't think it would be not?
I don't think it would be not.
It still aligns with this.
I still think it aligns with it.
I agree.
In kind of a different way. So it's hey, let's recapture this thing in our culture that we've given to sort of governmental agencies.
Let's build some houses.
Let's build some houses, and it's still for the betterment of the culture. And I see it as a positive thing. Being here in Arizona, wow, this is a great opportunity for us to say, let's re-engage in that. The Christian community has abdicated our responsibility for kind of, educating the next generation, which has not actually been the history of the church until lately. So now we've got an opportunity. Let's take it back. We look at the universities, we look at, hospitals, all of those have their roots in the church.
Yeah.
Those are things that we've kind of handed over to the state, and now we need to take back. The state, I don't think, equals necessarily the culture. It's like it's part of it.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more encompassing of a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
So I do think in that instance, for us, things were getting pretty hard at our school. And it's funny, we were talking to some friends of ours who their kids went to public school in Colorado. And you would think that it would be a little bit worse, but actually where we were at, it was a little bit worse than what they experienced. So they were like, oh, yeah, if that was going on at our school, we would have pulled them out too, And so I think we have to be really careful not to use our kids as tools for societal change. That's not fair to them. That's our job. And like I said, I didn't think it was fair to make my kids have to stand up to authority figures, especially in first grade. You're like, what is? What do I expect Maymay to do to her teacher who's telling her things that are not true? Like, of course she's going to hear that, and it's going to put like this sort of like dilemma in her life. And as her dad, my job's to try to protect her from that to a certain extent, and then coach her in how to interact with it as she gets older. You know?
And I will say, just kind of been thinking about this for a message upcoming too, and which I'm sure is exactly what you're indicating there too, right? The value of instilling in your kids, even at that young age, though. Like, okay, well, when this does come, we stand firm in what's true and what's good. And the nuances of how you do that in a way that's honoring and loving and not making enemies of people.
Totally.
But
you got to prepare them for that.
Yeah.
But I think it's foolish to use them as evangelistic tools.
I agree.
Like, I don't know how else to say it. Like, it feels like just throw them in the lions and they'll be okay. Like,
maybe invite them into that mission of your family and of the kingdom, but also they're children and you protect them.
Yes, and they are learning and they're trying to figure things out, and like,
they're susceptible
we forget that
deceived.
as parents. Like, oh well, you could stay strong. You're like, well, you can't expect a first grader to stay strong.
Yeah.
So like, your job is to raise them. Now, when they start to get teenagers, then they've got to start choosing here.
Yeah.
You know,
and you know your kids and where they're at, and hopefully you're being prayerful and seeking good counsel.
So
with parents.
It depends on the school. Like I said, I've heard of some public schools that are okay. Like, but you're going to definitely have to coach your kids through it. And in 2019, we were doing that. Our kids were kind of getting exposed to some things, but for the most part weren't a ton. But we still had to coach them through when they hear somebody talks about.
And that's not entirely new, right? Like when I was homeschooled through elementary school, and I went to high school, or went to junior high and high school and in public school, and my parents did a little bit of that, but they also knew and trusted me, and so that was there, and there was certainly a tension making that pit, but it was very different.
Yes,
certainly,
for sure.
At least quantitatively or qualitatively.
For sure. I think on the other side, one of the other thin ice things, but I think it's on everybody's mind, is like, we need to be praying for the political system in America, and there's some real angst around it. Like, I mean, I don't want to. You don't want to say, "Oh, everything's fine and totally normal." Well, that's not the case. We know that there's some real volatile, and you can point the finger all sorts of places, but we're in some real volatile times for sure, and this is a time to pray. I think it's a time to vote and be active and do all of that. But we also need to realize, and this is a good reminder, that politics is downstream from culture, not upstream. So we tend to use it as a tool, like, hey, maybe we could try to like change our culture through politics. That's not always the case. Sometimes that happens, and honestly, I have to say it happens a lot more as of late on the left. But it's still one of those things that we have to realize as a church. We are upstream from culture. Like we impact what happens. And again, this have kids, have grandkids, plant a garden. It feels like you're not changing politics. It feels like I need to get real active. And maybe you should. Maybe you're called to do that. Fine. Great. Wonderful. But I think what we have to do is come back to the long game, is the next generation. So I love the church getting involved in education again. Like I love the church getting back into, we talk a lot about spiritual disciplines and things like that long obedience in the same direction from Eugene Peterson, this coming back to spiritual formation and discipleship as being real central in the church. This is the precursor to the change that happens downstream. What we're seeing is a downstream thing that started in the 90s and 2000s. So the antidote in so many ways is still deeply personal and with your family. And you can make impact, and I've said this a lot. There are some people that are called to make impact and go start a nonprofit downtown and impact the homeless community. Great. I still think we're called to hospitality, and specifically toward people that are less than, or what is marginalized in society, no doubt. But I think a lot of people end up getting kind of deer in the headlights when they go, oh, I got to go to a foreign country and I got to do all these things. There is this good news, and again, Jeremiah 29 kind of pulls us into this, like, disciple your kids. Tell your neighbors about Jesus. have your family over that doesn't know Jesus and just love them. Don't look to go, how can I preach the gospel at them? Like, just love them for a little while. Like this sort of slowing down and this like, hey, do what you are graced to do with the energy that you have energy for. And the Lord's going, I will do with that something really miraculous. And if 10% of the people are like doing all the ministry, then of course, you got to get people starting nonprofits and ministering to thousands of people. But if everybody's doing just a little bit, then it's enough. Like then it's like, do what you have grace to do. And that's enough. That's the good news, I feel like, of Jeremiah 29.
And what's the impact if you think 7 years down the road? We've talked about this a lot over the last 9 months or so, right? As we're coming up on our 40th anniversary as a church. And one of the things that I've been feeling really, I've really been feeling from the Lord is a mindset for us to get into. And I think for us at Living Streams, but also for the church, and especially the church in America to be thinking about, right? So I'm a culture nerd. I study a lot of cultures and differences. And one of the paradigms, one of the personality characteristics of a culture is long-term versus short-term goals, right? And so in America, our culture is very much short-term goal oriented, right? And so we think of like, how are you going to get solvent in a year? How much money are you going to make in 5 years? And 10 years feels like really long-term. Yeah. But in other places, like most of Asia, for example, they're very long-term. So they're actually thinking, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, a couple generations down the road. A really beautiful image of this that we've talked about a lot. I don't think we talked about on the podcast, but maybe we have once, is this video I saw years ago of this little village somewhere, I think in central China, kind of really rainforesty region, very mountainous, right? And they have these valleys that during the rainy season once a year will turn into these torrentious rivers, right? Yeah. And the floods in those valleys and the rivers that tear through are so strong that it seems to be at least not practically possible, if not actually possible, to have a man-made structure of a bridge that will actually withstand those floods. Wow. And so what they do is something they've been doing for centuries, is they take these very slow-growing vines that turn into like cedar type, real thick as a car things over centuries, and they coax these vines over the valleys over the course of a couple of generations to create a living bridge that's literally rooted, and those rooted vine tree bridges are strong enough to withstand that. And the guy who plants the first vine will not see the two vines from either side of the valley touch. Yeah. It will be his children who will watch that bridge actually touch. It takes that long to grow over. Yeah. And yet they have dozens of these that are how the kids get to school. They walk over these bridges because for generations they've been doing this. And so I think it's really important for us to start shifting our mindset to like that of saying, what would I do if I were thinking about a goal for next year? But what would I do for 70 years, as this is saying, or for 40 years, as we've been talking about?
And I think this is, and I think I'm going to just land the plane on this thought here. My son, he's 15, and he'll be voting in the next, not this election, but the next election. And, it's like, again, we're talking about politics and culture and all these things, like how do you impact it? And so much of it comes down to, like, how am I discipling Toby? How am I discipling my son? And I think when we all look at it that way, and our job in the church has always been this. It's not to try to make a big deal out of ourselves or to build a kingdom for ourselves or to make ourselves important. It's always been, how can I hand the next generation a healthy church? And until the Lord comes back, that's our job. Our job is not, this is how we've always done it. Our job is not, like, hey, let's just hope we go back to these good old days. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the next generation. And God's going, look, have kids, have grandkids. And the implication there is not that they are going to be Babylonian in culture. Yeah. That they're going to retain the culture from Jerusalem, and this will be that land, that slow-growing bridge that bridges them from home across exile back to a new home,
Yeah.
and to the new Jerusalem. And that's what we're supposed to do. Like, we have to do the long growth thing. And just like you said, there are visions that we could cast. Some of them are long and specific, and some of them are just straight from the Bible, what we've always been called to do. But at the end of the day, if we don't get the next generation, we missed something.
Yeah.
And for most parents, you're the most important person in your kid's life. And if you're not purposefully discipling them, the world will disciple them. And that's what we're seeing a lot of. And so if we want to see this bridge built, we're going to have to disciple our kids really well.
Yeah,
so.
that's a great way to land the plane, Ryan. Well, thank you for listening or watching. Even if you're watching on YouTube, we're doing that now for this series. Thanks for being with us. Follow us, subscribe, whatever you're watching. That feels like a weird thing to say, but it feels like the thing you're supposed to say at the end of the podcast. And we really do appreciate the feedback we get from you guys. We really appreciate you guys tracking and listening all the way to the end. And I'll just end by saying, if you're feeling a little bit of the tension of being in a culture that seems foreign to you here, the word of Jeremiah 29, I think is really clear and really poignant and really valuable for us today. So, build your house, plant some gardens, multiply, and seek the welfare of the city that you're living in. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next week.